The wind over the steppe carried a bitterness that seemed to seep into bone and steel alike, as if even the land itself resisted the men who marched across it. By late 1941, the German advance into the Soviet Union had already rewritten the geography of war, yet it had also begun to reveal its limits. The promise of swift victory had faded into mud, ice, and exhaustion. Engines froze in the cold, rifles jammed, and soldiers who once believed themselves unstoppable now whispered about the winter as if it were a living enemy. In Moscow, where the threat loomed ever closer, Joseph Stalin refused evacuation, anchoring both government and morale with a stubborn declaration that the city would not fall. That decision, more than any speech, shaped what would follow. While the front stabilized temporarily under the crushing grip of winter, plans were already forming for the next great movement. Adolf Hitler, increasingly obsessed with resources rather than territory alone, turned his attention south. Oil had become the lifeblood of modern warfare, and the Soviet fields of the Caucasus promised both survival and dominance. The plan, known as Case Blue, was ambitious even by the standards of the war. It called for the splitting of forces, one thrust driving toward the oil-rich regions, the other toward a city that would soon become synonymous with destruction: Stalingrad. The city itself stretched along the western bank of the Volga River, an industrial spine of factories and workers' housing. It was not merely symbolic because it bore Stalin's name, but also strategic, serving as a vital artery for transport and production. Yet when the first waves of German aircraft appeared overhead in August 1942, symbolism and strategy were alike consumed by fire. Bombs fell in relentless waves, turning streets into rubble and homes into graves. Tens of thousands of civilians perished in a matter of hours, and what remained of the city was transformed into a jagged labyrinth of ruins. Ironically, the destruction that seemed to signal inevitable defeat became the foundation of resistance. Tanks could not maneuver easily through shattered streets, and visibility was reduced to narrow corridors of broken walls and smoke. Soviet forces, under commanders such as Vasily Chukov, adapted quickly. They abandoned the idea of large-scale defensive lines and instead fought for individual buildings, staircases, even rooms. The phrase, "not one step back," reinforced by strict orders from above, was no longer rhetoric but a condition of survival. German troops, advancing into the city, encountered a form of warfare they had not expected. Every corner concealed danger. Snipers waited patiently for hours or days, turning movement into a deadly gamble. Assaults that would have taken minutes in open terrain now dragged on for days. A factory might change hands multiple times within a single day, each exchange measured in blood and exhaustion. Soldiers on both sides began to lose any clear sense of front lines. The battlefield was everywhere. On the banks of the Volga, the Soviet lifeline remained tenuous but unbroken. Boats crossed under constant threat, bringing reinforcements and supplies while evacuating the wounded. Many never made the journey, yet enough succeeded to sustain the defense. Artillery positioned on the eastern bank provided crucial support, firing into the city with calculated precision. The defenders learned to stay close to their enemies, minimizing the effectiveness of German air power and artillery. It was a brutal intimacy, one that reduced the technological advantage of the attackers. As autumn deepened, the German advance slowed to a crawl. The Sixth Army, under General Friedrich Paulus, had expected victory, but instead found itself trapped in a battle of attrition. Morale began to erode, not suddenly but steadily, like stone worn down by water. Letters home spoke less of triumph and more of survival. Food became scarce, ammunition had to be rationed, and the wounded often remained where they fell, unable to be evacuated. Meanwhile, beyond the immediate struggle for the city, Soviet planners prepared something far more decisive. Under the direction of generals such as Georgy Zhukov, a counteroffensive took shape. It was not aimed at pushing the Germans out of the city directly, but at something more devastating: encirclement. The flanks of the German position were held not by elite units but by Allied forces, less equipped and more vulnerable. It was here that the Soviets would strike. When Operation Uranus began in November 1942, it unfolded with a speed and coordination that surprised even those who had planned it. Massive concentrations of troops, supported by artillery and armor, broke through the weaker lines on either side of the German advance. Within days, the encirclement was complete. The Sixth Army, which had fought so hard to take Stalingrad, now found itself trapped within it. The transformation was immediate and catastrophic. Supply lines were cut, and attempts to sustain the army by air proved inadequate. Aircraft could not deliver enough food, fuel, or ammunition, and many were lost to anti-aircraft fire and harsh weather. Inside the pocket, conditions deteriorated rapidly. Hunger became a constant presence. Frostbite claimed limbs. Disease spread among men already weakened by exhaustion and malnutrition. Despite the situation, orders from above forbade retreat. Hitler insisted that the army hold its position, promising relief that would never truly come. Paulus, bound by duty and circumstance, complied, even as the reality around him grew increasingly desperate. The soldiers endured, not out of hope, but because there was no alternative. Winter returned with a severity that seemed almost deliberate. Temperatures plummeted, and the ruins of the city offered little protection. The once mighty army, which had crossed continents in triumph, was reduced to scattered groups clinging to survival. Ammunition ran low, and weapons became useless in the cold. Men wrapped themselves in whatever they could find, often scavenging from the dead. In January 1943, the end became inevitable. Soviet forces tightened the encirclement, advancing steadily into the shrinking pocket. Resistance continued, but it was fragmented and increasingly futile. One by one, positions fell. Communication broke down, and units were isolated from one another. The sense of unity that had once defined the army dissolved into individual struggles for survival. When Paulus finally surrendered, it marked not just the end of a battle, but a turning point in the war itself. The loss was immense, both in terms of manpower and morale. For the first time, the German advance had been not merely halted, but decisively reversed. The initiative passed to the Soviets, who would carry it forward with relentless determination. Yet beyond the strategic implications, the battle left something deeper and more enduring. It revealed the limits of power when confronted with resilience. It showed how a city reduced to rubble could become an unbreakable fortress, and how ordinary individuals, placed in extraordinary circumstances, could shape the course of history. The ruins of Stalingrad were not merely the remnants of destruction, but the foundation of a new momentum, one that would carry the war westward, all the way to Berlin. Long after the guns fell silent, the memory of the battle remained. Not as a single narrative, but as countless individual stories, each marked by hardship, courage, and loss. Soldiers who had fought there would remember not grand strategies, but the faces of those beside them, the sound of footsteps in shattered corridors, the cold that never seemed to end. And in those memories, the battle continued, not as history, but as something lived and endured. In the end, Stalingrad was more than a battle. It was a moment when the direction of the war shifted, when the illusion of inevitability was broken, and when the cost of ambition was revealed in its fullest measure. It stood as a testament to the idea that even in the darkest conditions, resistance could not only survive, but prevail.